They thought the old man had nothing: an old house, a rusty car, and meals eaten alone. His three biological children only called when they needed money, then vanished like smoke. They plotted to sell his house before he even died. They thought he didn't know. But he knew everything. He kept a record of it all. And he was waiting for the right moment to turn it all upside down, because the man sitting alone eating cold rice held $40 million. Click like, comment. The city you're viewing to let me know how far my story has progressed. And follow to the end, because the ending will surprise you. The last time my daughter called me on my birthday, she was 43 minutes late, and the first thing she said wasn't happy birthday. It was, "Dad, I need to ask you something." I already knew what was coming. I sat there in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, watching the candle I'd lit for myself melt down into the chocolate cake I'd bought at half price from the grocery store bakery. One candle. I'd stopped putting the right number years ago. Too many, and the cake just burns. "Go ahead, Rachel," I said. "The car registration is due and Marcus's firm is doing layoffs and we're just—" She stopped, regrouped. "We're stretched thin right now. You know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. I'd been knowing how it was for the better part of 20 years. "How much?" I asked. 2,000. Maybe 2,500 if you can. The candle dripped wax onto the frosting. I watched it harden. "I'll send it tomorrow," I said. "You're the best, Dad. I love you. I'll call you next week, okay?" She didn't call next week. She didn't call the week after that either. I kept the cake in the refrigerator until it went dry on the edges, eating a slice every other morning with my coffee, standing at the counter because it felt wasteful to set the table for one. My name is Ethan Mercer. I am 73 years old. I have 3 children, a modest house at the edge of a small town in eastern Ohio, a 2009 Subaru with a cracked dashboard, and a very particular kind of loneliness that I don't think most people understand. The kind that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who look right through you. What I'm about to tell you is the truth. Not a flattering version, not a cleaned up version. I did things wrong. I made choices I regret. But I also endured things that no father should have to endure from his own children, and I kept quiet for far too long, because I was raised in a time when you didn't air that kind of laundry. You just kept folding it, kept stacking it, kept pretending the pile wasn't reaching the ceiling. Let me take you back to where it started, or rather, to where it stopped feeling like a family, and started feeling like something else entirely. My wife, Carolyn, died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosis to funeral was 4 months and 3 weeks, which sounds merciful when people say it out loud. At least it was quick. But I assure you, there is nothing merciful about watching someone disappear in front of your eyes and being powerless to stop it. Carolyn was the one who held the family together. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who mediated the arguments between the kids, who always knew when someone was struggling before they said a word. When she was in the hospital, all 3 of our children showed up. They sat vigil, they cried, they held her hand and told her they loved her. And then she was gone, and slowly, almost without anyone noticing, so was everything else. Rachel, our eldest, is 51 now. She lives 40 minutes away in a suburb with her husband Marcus and 2 teenage kids I barely know. She's sharp, organized, successful in a way that has always seemed designed to prove something, rather than to enjoy anything. Growing up, she was the responsible one, the planner. She made lists, she color-coded her school binders. When Carolyn got sick, Rachel managed the insurance paperwork and the hospital appointments with the kind of competence that looked like love from a distance, but up close felt more like a project she was efficiently completing. After Carolyn died, Rachel called every few weeks for the first year, then monthly, then on holidays if I was lucky. When she did call, the conversations followed a pattern that became so predictable I could have scripted them from the first syllable. Small talk about the weather or the grandchildren I'd never seen enough of, a quick check that I hadn't fallen or gotten sick, and then, usually within 10 or 15 minutes, the real reason for the call. Money, favors, help with something. Never just, "How are you, Dad? Are you okay? Are you lonely?" My son Daniel is 48. He lives out in Arizona, which he moved to 3 years after Carolyn died. and which always felt, though I never said so, like a very deliberate choice of distance. Daniel was always the volatile one. Big emotions, big swings, big enthusiasm for things that usually ran out of steam within a year. He'd been in real estate, then insurance, then some kind of online business that he could never quite explain to me in terms I understood. He called less than Rachel. When he did call, he was either riding high on some new venture that was definitely going to be different this time, Dad, or he was in a hole and needed pulling out. I helped him more than I should have. I know that now. I helped him out of holes I'd told him not to dig. And then there was my youngest, Thomas. 44 years old and the one who hurt me the most. Not because he was the cruelest, he wasn't, not on the surface, but because he was the closest, physically, and that proximity made his indifference feel like a daily choice. Thomas lived 12 minutes from my house. He drove past my street on his way to work every single morning. In 11 years, he had stopped and unannounced exactly twice, and both times he needed something from me. Once to borrow my truck, once to ask me to watch his dog while he and his wife took a trip to Cancun. His wife, Sandra, didn't like me. She'd never liked me. She was polite in the way that people are when they're making sustained effort to conceal something, and after Carolyn died and I was no longer part of a set, no longer Ethan and Carolyn, just plain Ethan, alone, aging. Sandra's polite tolerance curdled into something that felt very much like contempt. She referred to me, I would later find out, as the old man problem. Thomas never corrected her, as far as I knew. The house I live in is small. 3 bedrooms, though I only use one now. The kitchen linoleum is lifting at one corner, and I've taped it down so many times the tape marks left a gray smear that won't come clean. The back porch needs repainting. The gutters need clearing. Every fall I think I'll get to them, and every fall something else takes priority. Or I just don't. The truth is that keeping up a house alone at 73 is harder than people think, and I've made peace with the fact that the place looks a little worn. It looks like a man who's been living in it without backup, which is what it is. My children never offered to help with any of it. Thomas drove past 12 minutes away, and the gutters would fill with leaves and sit there all winter, and he never once pulled into the driveway and said, "Dad, let me get a ladder." I wasn't completely without company. There was my neighbor, Frank Dalton, 76, a retired electrician who moved in next door 8 years ago after his own wife passed. Frank and I developed the particular friendship of 2 old men with nowhere urgent to be. We'd drink coffee on my porch in the mornings, argue about baseball, watch the squirrels destroy Frank's bird feeder with the weary resignation of men who'd learned not to fight battles they couldn't win. Frank wasn't educated in the way my children valued education. He dropped out of high school at 17, worked with his hands his whole life, told the same 4 stories on rotation. But Frank showed up. When I had a bout of bronchitis 2 winters ago, Frank drove me to the clinic, sat in the waiting room for 2 hours reading a 3-year-old fishing magazine, and then went to the pharmacy and picked up my prescription without being asked. My own son, 12 minutes away, sent a text. "Hope you feel better soon, Dad." There was also Marguerite Osei, who ran the community garden 2 blocks over and had recruited me 5 years ago into helping tend a small plot there. Marguerite was 68, Nigerian-American, recently retired from nursing, and possessed of a frankness that I'd found startling at first and then came to genuinely love. She said what she thought. She didn't dress it up. When I mentioned once, casually, that my children didn't visit much, she looked at me for a moment and said, "Ethan, that doesn't sound like not much. That sounds like not at all." I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. These were my people. A retired electrician and a retired nurse, both of them widowed, both of them moving through the back half of their lives with the specific grace of people who've learned to find meaning in small things, because the big things are mostly behind them. They made me laugh. They ate my cooking without complaint, even when it wasn't very good. They remembered what I'd told them, and my 3 children, collectively, in 11 years, had visited for a total of perhaps 30 or 40 hours. I thought about that math a lot in the evenings. Now I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone, not Frank, not Marguerite, not even my attorney James Hollis, who knew the facts of it but not the weight of it, not what it meant to me to carry it for so long. My wife's father, Harold Vance, was a man I never fully understood while he was alive. He died 6 years after Carolyn, quietly, in a care facility in western Pennsylvania, with very little fanfare. Harold had been a civil engineer who'd made careful, unsexy investments for 50 years. Land, low-profile real estate in growing corridors, a small portfolio of stock that he'd never touched, never braided out into anything showy. He didn't look wealthy. He drove an old pickup. He ate at diners. He wore the same 3 pairs of khakis for 20 years. Harold had no other living relatives. His wife, Carolyn's mother, had died before Carolyn did. His only sibling passed in the late 90s. He and I had never been especially close while Carolyn was alive. He was reserved. I was uncertain of how to reach him. But in the years after Carolyn's death, something shifted between us. I drove out to see him a handful of times. We sat together and talked about her in the honest way that grief allows, without performance. He told me stories about her childhood I'd never heard. I told him things about our life together that I thought he'd want to know. A year before he died, Harold called me. He asked me to drive out. We sat at his little table in the care facility common room, and he slid an envelope across to me and said, "I need you to read this and tell me if you understand it." It was a document from his attorney. I read it twice. Then I looked up at him. "Harold," I said, "this can't be right." He said, "It's right." He had accumulated, over 50 years of quiet work and quieter spending, assets valued at just over $40 million. Land holdings, stocks, a few commercial properties held under a management company so anonymous that I hadn't even recognized the name when I'd passed one of the buildings. And he was leaving all of it, every last dollar, to me, not to my children, to me. I told him I didn't want it, or rather, I told him I didn't need it, which was different. He shook his head. He said, "You stayed. After Carolyn died, you could have walked away from me. Nobody would have blamed you. Instead, you drove 3 hours to sit with an old man and talk about his daughter. That matters, Ethan. That's the only thing that matters." He died 8 months later. The estate took 2 years to settle. Harold had structured it carefully, but carefully doesn't mean quickly. When James Hollis finally called me with the final numbers, I sat in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and looked out at the lifting linoleum and thought, I could fix that now. I didn't fix it. I taped it back down. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because changing things felt like announcing something I wasn't ready to announce. Maybe because the life I'd built inside this small house, the coffee with Frank, the garden with Marguerite, the long evenings with books and the radio, had its own kind of dignity that I didn't want to disturb. I'd watched money change people. I'd watched it happen slowly, almost invisibly, and then all at once. I wasn't ready for all at once. So I kept it quiet. I kept going to the discount grocery. I kept wearing the same coats. I kept driving the cracked dashboard Subaru. And I kept watching. Quotes. The first time I understood how bad it had gotten was a Sunday in early November, about 2 years after Harold's estate closed. Thomas had invited me to dinner, an actual sit-down dinner at his house, which happened maybe 3 or 4 times a year, always when Sandra was in a rare, generous mood, or, I suspected, when they wanted something. I drove the 12 minutes with a bottle of wine and a pie I'd made from scratch, because Carolyn had always said, you don't show up to someone's house empty-handed, and I'd kept that practice even when the someone was my own son. Sandra answered the door. She looked at the pie, then at me, and said, "You didn't have to do that," in a tone that meant she found it mildly embarrassing. Dinner was fine in the way that dinners can be fine while containing absolutely nothing real. Thomas talked about work. Sandra talked about some renovation they were planning for the master bathroom. I asked questions. I listened. The grandchildren, Thomas and Sandra's 2 kids, Leo, 17, and Brianna, 15, sat at the table with their phones face down, performing the presence their parents required of them without actually delivering it. After dinner, Thomas poured himself another glass of wine, and Sandra took the kids upstairs, and Thomas got to the point. "We've been talking about the house," he said. "Which house?" He looked at me. "Your house, Dad." I set down my coffee cup. "What about it?" Sandra and I were just thinking. It's a lot for you, right? Maintaining it alone. And it's in a decent location, even if the house itself is... He stopped, chose a word. "Dated." "What are you saying, Thomas?" We were thinking if anything ever happened to you, it might make sense to, I mean, we'd sell it, obviously. The land is worth something, even if the structure isn't. It's just good to have a plan. I looked at my son. He was 44 years old, sitting at his dining room table in a house that was perfectly fine, wearing a watch that had cost more than my monthly groceries, talking about the plan for what to do with my house after I died, while I was still alive, while I was sitting 6 feet away from him. I said, "Nothing's happened to me yet, Thomas." He laughed, a little uncomfortably. "Obviously, I'm just being practical." I went home that night, and I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I didn't cry. I was past crying about this, I think. I opened a notebook, the old composition kind, black and white cover, the kind I'd been using for years to keep grocery lists and appointments. And I wrote down what Thomas had said, the exact words, the date, the context. I didn't know yet why I was doing it, but something in me said, write it down. So I did. That notebook became something else over the next 18 months. It became a record, not because I had a plan, not at first, but because I've always been a man who processes things by writing them down. And the things that were happening were so painful and so relentless that I had to do something with them or I'd drown. Rachel called in March asking for money for a kitchen renovation, not a repair. A renovation. New countertops, new appliances, the whole project. "Just a loan, Dad. We'll pay you back." $2,200. They never mentioned paying it back again. Daniel called in May because he'd gotten into trouble with a business partner and needed, the number went up during the conversation, first $3,000, then $5,000. Then, "I know this is a lot, but it's just until the end of the month, Dad. I swear." $8,000 total. He paid back $500 3 months later and never mentioned the rest. In June, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear. Thomas and Sandra didn't know I'd arrived early to a family dinner at Rachel's house. I let myself into the side door because Rachel had given me a key years ago, and I was in the hallway when I heard them in the kitchen, voices low but not low enough. Sandra was saying, "He's just going to leave it all to charity anyway. You know how he is, so what's even the point?" Thomas said, "He's got maybe 10 years left, maybe less, and if we're not in position by then—" "In position," Sandra repeated, in a way that made clear she'd said this before. "Thomas, we're not in position because there's nothing to be in position for. The man has a beat-up house and a pension. You need to accept that. He might have more than he's letting on. Grandpa Vance's estate went to probate. That was public record. There was nothing." I stood in the hallway of my daughter's house and heard my son and daughter-in-law discuss my net worth and my estimated time of death with the detached focus of people reviewing a bad investment. I stood very still. I breathed. Then I went back out the side door, walked around the block once, came back, rang the doorbell, and had dinner with my family. That night I wrote it down. Every word I could remember. The date, the time, who said what. By the end of summer, the notebook was half full. I want to be fair. I want to tell you that it wasn't all like that. That there were good moments, warmth, real connection beneath the transactional rot. And maybe there were, years ago. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, editing toward the dark because the dark is what was freshest. Grief does that. Loneliness does it worse. But I also have the notebooks. I have the records. And the records don't lie the way memory does. What I can tell you is that by the second year after I started writing things down, the dynamic had shifted so far toward the extractive that I barely recognized the relationships as parental anymore. I had become, in my children's lives, a resource. A complicated, aging, mildly inconvenient resource that would eventually, upon conclusion, yield one more payout in the form of a small house and its contents. Daniel stopped calling unless he needed something. When I didn't immediately offer help one month, I was waiting, testing. He got short with me. "You'd think your own father could help out," he said, and then caught himself and dialed it back. But it was out, and I'd heard it. Rachel developed a habit of having her husband Marcus call me instead of calling herself, which was its own particular communication, a two-step delegation that told me where I ranked on her list of priorities. Marcus was perfectly nice, But he was also clearly calling because Rachel had asked him to, and I could hear in his voice the mild discomfort of a man performing a duty he'd been assigned. Thomas stopped inviting me to dinner, or rather, the invitations became Christmas and Thanksgiving, and sometimes not even that. Sometimes it was a call on the holiday itself. Short, perfunctory, children in the background shrieking about something. "Can't really talk, Dad, it's crazy here, but we're thinking of you." They were thinking of me. The loneliness of it was of a very specific texture, not the loneliness of being unloved. I don't think I was unloved exactly in the way that feeling is usually meant. I think my children were capable of something like love, in the abstract, in the way you can love a concept of a person. What they were not capable of, or not bothering to practice, was the work of love, the showing up, the remembering, the actual daily or weekly presence that takes effort. Carolyn had understood this. She'd said to me once, near the end, when she was already very sick, "Ethan, don't let them take advantage of you. You know they will if they can. You're too soft." I'd told her she was wrong. She wasn't wrong. Frank told me something once, on the porch, third or fourth cup of coffee, one of those fall mornings when the air has that particular sharpness that means winter is coming. He said, "You know what I think your problem is?" I said, "You're going to tell me whether I want to know or not." "Your problem," he said, "is that you think if you're patient enough, they'll figure it out themselves, like they'll just wake up one day and realize." "Maybe they will," Frank snorted. He picked up his coffee. "Ethan, my son didn't figure it out until I stopped answering the phone for 2 weeks. I mean, stopped. Didn't pick up, didn't call back. 2 weeks. You know what it took for him to show up at my door?" He held up 2 fingers. 2 weeks. "That worked?" "It started working," Frank said. "That's the most you can ask for with grown kids, I think. It starts working." I thought about what it would mean to stop answering the phone, to let the calls go to voicemail, to wait, to make my absence as real to them as theirs had been to me. I wasn't ready for that yet, but I filed it away. What I was doing instead was something slower and more deliberate. I was building. I was building a record, and I was building a different life, quietly, carefully, out of the sight of people who'd decided I had nothing worth paying attention to. I'd been having regular conversations with James Hollis, not about anything dramatic, estate planning mostly, which is the kind of thing a man in his 70s is supposed to do, and which my children would have had no particular response to, even if they'd known about it, because to them the estate in question was a small house and a pension. James had helped me understand Harold's assets, had been managing the portfolio conservatively, and we talked through what I wanted to do with it. "You could give it all to charity," James said once. "You could give portions to whoever you choose. It's your money, Ethan. The law is very clear about that." "I know," I said. "Do you have any sense of what you want to do?" I did have a sense. It had been forming for months, growing clearer the longer I kept the notebook, the longer I sat on Frank's porch and ate dinner at Marguerite's and watched my children engage with me in the specific, practiced way of people who have learned to want something from someone without showing it too plainly. I wanted to be fair. I kept coming back to that. I didn't want to be vindictive. I wasn't a vindictive man, or I hadn't been, and I wasn't going to become one at 73. But I also wanted, for the first time in 11 years, to make a choice that was entirely mine, not obligated, not extracted, not performed out of the fear that the alternative was being cut off from my own grandchildren, just mine. The community garden had a problem that fall. One of the long-term plots was being crowded out by an invasive vine that Marguerite had been fighting for 2 seasons, and one October Saturday, we spent the whole morning pulling it out, both of us on our knees in the dirt, sweating through the cool air, cursing under our breath in the particular relaxed way you can only do with someone you trust. Marguerite said, at one point, straightening up and pressing her hand to her lower back, "Ethan, I want to ask you something personal." "Go ahead." "Are your children good to you?" I kept pulling Vine. I didn't answer right away. She said, "I ask because I've known you 5 years, and in 5 years I've seen Frank more than I've seen any of your children." I sat back on my heels. The dirt was cold through my knees. The sky was that particular Ohio October blue that always makes me think of Carolyn, for reasons I've never fully identified. No, I said. They're not really. Marguerite nodded, not with satisfaction, just with the steady acknowledgement of someone who'd suspected the answer and was simply receiving confirmation. What are you going to do about it? She asked. I don't know yet, I said. That was the truth. I didn't know yet. I had money I hadn't told anyone about. I had a record of 11 years of neglect and extraction. I had a life that, in spite of everything, contained real warmth. Frank's coffee, Marguerite's frankness, the particular peace of my small house in the evenings when the light came through the kitchen window at the angle Carolyn had always called the golden hour. I had, for the first time, something I hadn't had in years, the faint, cautious beginning of a plan. I didn't know all of it yet, but I knew one thing clearly. I was done being taken for granted. I was done being a resource. I was done writing down the date and the words and the cost of each small wound and putting it in a notebook on the shelf. The notebooks were full enough. It was almost time to do something with them. The plan didn't come to me all at once. That's not how things work when you're 73 and you've spent most of your adult life being a reasonable person. Reasonable people don't make dramatic plans. They adjust. They accommodate. They tell themselves the situation will improve on its own, because the alternative, accepting that the people you raised have become people you don't fully recognize, is a grief that sits in a different category from the kind that has funerals and casseroles and neighbors stopping by. This grief is quieter, and it lasts longer. What I did through that winter and into the following spring was watch. I'd always been a watcher. Carolyn used to tease me about it, said I had the patience of a man who'd accepted that the world moved at its own pace, and there was no use arguing with it. She wasn't wrong, but watching, after a certain point, becomes its own kind of suffering if you don't eventually do something with what you've seen. I kept the notebooks. I kept meeting with James. And I started, slowly, to understand what I actually wanted the end of this story to look like. It was Frank who pushed the first real piece into place, though he didn't know he was doing it. It was February, one of those Ohio February mornings where the cold has a personal quality to it, like it's specifically annoyed with you, and we were in my kitchen instead of on the porch because neither of us was stupid enough to sit outside in that. Frank had brought a box of those glazed donuts from the gas station on Route 9, the ones that are objectively not good, and that we both ate without any shame whatsoever, and he was telling me about his son's latest visit, an actual visit, 2 days, which Frank described with the pleased disbelief of a man who's learned not to expect things and is therefore genuinely surprised when they happen. He fixed the step, Frank said. The one on the back porch that's been rotting for 2 years. Just went out there with his toolbox and fixed it. Didn't ask, just did it. That's good, I said. Yeah. He broke a donut in half. You know what I think made the difference? I stopped pretending everything was fine. I stopped acting like it didn't hurt when he forgot to call. I said it out loud. I said, Kevin, it hurts when you don't call. Just like that, like an adult. He shrugged. He didn't know what to do with that for about a month. Then he fixed the step. I thought about that for a while. My kids know it hurts. Frank looked at me. Do they? I didn't answer right away because the honest answer was, I wasn't sure. I'd never said it the way Frank was describing, plain, direct, without softening. I'd hinted. I'd made small comments that I expected them to understand. I'd been, as Carolyn would have put it, too soft. Too much the person who absorbs rather than the person who names. Maybe not, I admitted. You should try it, Frank said. Worst case, nothing changes. Best case, he held up the half donut. Fixed step. I didn't try it. Not the way Frank meant. But the conversation shifted something in me, pointed it in a new direction, and 2 weeks later I called Thomas. Not to ask for anything, not to respond to anything, just to call, which I hadn't done in months because I'd fallen into the same pattern they had, waiting to be contacted rather than reaching out, matching their energy in a way that I told myself was pride, but was probably closer to defeat. I called Thomas on a Tuesday evening, and he picked up on the fourth ring with the specific tone of a man who looked at the caller ID and chose to answer anyway, which was already more than I sometimes expected. Dad, hey, everything okay? That was always the first question. Is something wrong? Are you sick? Did something happen? Because apparently the only reason I might be calling was emergency. Everything's fine, I said. I just wanted to talk. A pause. Oh, okay. I'm just, we're kind of in the middle of dinner. I can call another time. No, hang on. I heard him move, heard a door, the background noise of the house receding. Okay, what's up? What's up? 44 years old and what's up was how he talked to his father. I wanted to know how you are, I said. How Leo and Brianna are doing. How work is. Another pause. Shorter, but noticeable. The pause of a man recalibrating for a conversation that wasn't going the direction he'd braced for. Everyone's good, he said. Leo's looking at colleges, if you can believe that. Brianna's doing her volleyball thing. He paused. Work's fine. Busy. Is there anything you need? I asked, and I watched myself ask it with the particular clarity of someone who already knows the answer. Actually, Thomas said, and I felt it before he even finished the sentence, the shift in his voice from guarded pleasant to something easier, something practiced. Sandra and I have been talking about refinancing, and we're a little short on the closing costs. It's just timing, Dad. It'll all work out. But if you had maybe, it's $4,000, we'd pay it back by... I said, I don't have it, Thomas. Silence. Oh, he said, I'm sorry, things are tight right now. No, of course, that's fine. Don't worry about it. We talked for 3 more minutes, and then he had to get back to dinner. I sat with the phone in my hand and thought, so that's the test. That was what the call was for him. Not the conversation, not the father-son part, not the Leo and college part. The call was a container for the ask. And when the ask came up empty, the call was over. I wrote it down. Spring came, which in eastern Ohio means mud and then more mud, and then 1 week of something almost pleasant before the humidity arrives and makes everything a fight. I was in the garden with Marguerite on a Saturday in April when my phone rang and it was Rachel, which was unusual for a Saturday morning. Dad, I need to talk to you about something. I kept working the soil. I'm listening. It's about the house. I stopped. My house? We've been talking, all 3 of us, actually, and we're worried. The house is getting older, you're getting older, and if something happened, medically, the situation could get complicated. We think you should think about a plan. I crouched there in the April mud, and I was very careful to keep my voice even. What kind of plan? Maybe assisted living, eventually, or, look, the house has value, Dad, even in its current condition. If you were to sell now, while the market is decent, you could use the equity to cover care costs, and the rest could... She stopped, then kept going. We just want to make sure you're taken care of. I noted the phrasing. We just want to make sure you're taken care of. The most generous interpretation was that this was genuine concern. But I'd been listening to my children for 11 years, and I had learned to hear what lived beneath the sentences. And what I heard beneath those sentences was, we want to make sure the asset is liquidated in a way that benefits us before the situation gets messy. Who is we? I asked. Me and Thomas, and Daniel, we talked to him last week. So they'd had a meeting, the 3 of them, about me, without telling me, and then Rachel had been elected to make the call. The organizational efficiency of it almost impressed me. I'm not selling the house, Rachel, I said. Dad, I'm 73, not 90. I'm healthy. The house is mine. I'm not selling it. A sigh. The particular sigh of a woman who considers herself the family's most competent adult and finds incompetence in others deeply taxing. Dad, we're just trying to be practical. I know, I said. I know you are. I got off the phone and sat in the mud for a minute, the April cold coming up through my knees. Marguerite had stopped working and was looking at me from across the row. Your kids? She asked. Yeah. How bad? I thought about it. They're discussing selling my house, together, like it's a project they're managing. Marguerite made a sound, so not quite words, something lower than that. The sound of someone who has seen this particular variety of human behavior before and has run out of surprise for it. Ethan, she said, you need to stop being polite. I know. I mean it. Being polite is costing you something. She was right. Being polite was what I'd been doing for 11 years, and it had cost me my daughter's respect, my son's basic consideration, and somewhere along the way, the simple daily comfort of a family that behaved like one. Politeness had gotten me nothing except a very detailed record of how it could be used against me. I went home that afternoon and called James Hollis. "I'm ready," I said, "to get specific." The conversations with James over the following months were the most purposeful I'd had in years. He was methodical, which I appreciated, and he asked good questions, which I appreciated more. He didn't tell me what to do. He laid out the options and let me think through them, which is the correct way to treat a 73-year-old man who is competent, solvent, and capable of deciding the shape of his own life. I told him about Marguerite's community garden, that there was a capital campaign to expand the program into 2 neighboring towns, that Marguerite had been running it on donations and grants that were never quite enough, that the work she did was real and visible and changed people's days in ways that were modest but not small. I told him about Frank, who had a granddaughter in college studying environmental science, and who couldn't quite cover the gap between her scholarship and her tuition without Frank quietly drawing down savings he'd intended to keep as a cushion. I told him about a small literacy nonprofit on the other side of town that I'd been quietly following for a year, run by a woman named Patricia Huang, 55, who'd spent 20 years as a teacher before starting it with her own money, and who was on the verge of having to cut 2 of her 3 staff positions because the fundraising cycle had been brutal. And I told him what I wanted for my children, which took longer, and which I got wrong the first time and had to revise because I went back and forth more than I want to admit. There was a version of this where I left them nothing, and I sat with that version for a while, held it up, turned it over. It was clean. It was logical. It was also, I decided, not who I was or who I wanted to be at the end of my life. They were still my children. Whatever else they were, careless, extractive, capable of discussing my death like a real estate transaction. They were also, somewhere underneath all of that, the people I'd held when they were small and sick and scared. That doesn't disappear. You don't get to make it disappear just because it would be tidier. But love is not the same as reward. I'd confused the two for 11 years, and the confusion had cost both of us something. Me, my dignity. Them, the lesson that their behavior had consequences. You can love someone and still hold them accountable for what they've done. That was the thing I'd been unable to do until now. So what I told James was this: I wanted something for each of them. Enough to acknowledge that they were my children, that there had been real years of real family, but not enough to reward 11 years of neglect and extraction, and the specifics of what enough meant, and what the conditions were, and what the structure of the whole estate would look like. That James and I worked through across 4 conversations spread over 3 months. I wasn't finished yet, but I was building something, and for the first time in a long time, the building felt purposeful. The moment that broke something open, not in a planned way, but in the way that things break when they've been under pressure long enough, happened in late September. Daniel had called the week before, a longer call than usual, and I'd noticed something different in his voice. Not the practiced warmth he used when he needed something, and not the forced brightness of holiday check-ins. Something tighter. He'd been talking around something for 20 minutes. Work, the weather in Arizona, some neighbor dispute that he drew out longer than it deserved, and then he'd said he had to go, and hung up, and I'd sat with the phone and thought, he's going to call back. He called back 4 days later. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be upset. Nothing that starts that way ends well." "Go ahead." Okay, so there's a situation with a business partner, and it's gotten legal." I was quiet. "It's not criminal," he said quickly. "It's a civil dispute. But there's a lawsuit, and my attorney says—" He stopped, and I could hear him rubbing his face, that old gesture he'd had since he was a teenager when things were harder than he could manage. "Dad, I need help. Real help. Not like before. This is different." "How much, Daniel?" $40,000. The number sat there between us like something dropped from a height. $40,000, I said. I know, but if I don't settle this, it goes to court, and if it goes to court—" He let it trail off. "I've got nowhere else to turn. I've been everywhere. Sandra and Thomas said—" You asked Thomas and Sandra first? A pause that answered the question without words. I asked everyone, Wasib, he said. Dad, please. I sat in my kitchen. The linoleum was still taped at the corner. The evening light came through the window at the angle Carolyn had called the golden hour. And I thought about what Carolyn had said near the end. Don't let them take advantage, you're too soft. And I thought about Frank's fixed step, and Marguerite in the mud telling me that being polite was costing me something, and 11 years of notebooks on the shelf. I said, Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Okay. When is the last time you called me and didn't need anything? Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Dad, I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm asking because I need to understand something. When is the last time you called because you wanted to know how I was? Not because you needed something, just how I was. The silence this time had a different quality. It had weight in it. I don't know, Daniel said finally, and his voice had changed. The practiced surface of it was gone, and what was underneath was something younger and less defended and considerably more honest. I don't know, Dad. I know that's a bad answer. It's an honest one, I said. Are you going to help me? I looked out the window. The light was doing the thing it did in September, the particular low gold of late afternoon that meant summer was finally giving up. Not with $40,000, I said. I don't have it to give. Which was true in the specific sense that I didn't have it in any account he knew about, and I was choosing, very carefully, not to lie and not to reveal. But I want you to call me next week, not to ask for anything, just to talk. Another pause. Okay. I mean it, Daniel, next week, just to talk. He said he would. He didn't, not the following week, though he did call the week after. And the call was different, awkward in places, the kind of awkward that comes from two people who haven't had a real conversation in years and have forgotten how. But it was real. It was the first real thing in longer than I could comfortably say. I didn't write it in the notebook. It was the first thing in months that I didn't write down, because it felt like it deserved to exist outside of the record. October brought an event I hadn't expected. Thomas called, and not for money, the first time in so long that I'd lost count, and asked if he could come by. Just him, not Sandra, not the kids, just Thomas. He showed up on a Sunday afternoon with a six-pack of beer that he knew I didn't drink, and which I suspected he'd grabbed in a panic on the way over, not knowing what else to bring. We sat on the porch, even though it was cold, because he'd always liked the porch, and for a while we just sat there with our hands around our cans and looked at Frank's yard, where the bird feeder was still standing despite the squirrels' best efforts. I've been thinking, Thomas said. I waited. About the house thing, what Rachel said, the three of us talking about your plans. Without telling you, he looked at the bird feeder. That was wrong, I know that. Yes, I said. It was. He flinched a little. I think he'd expected me to say it's okay, or I understand, or some other version of the softening I'd been providing for 11 years. I didn't. I've been a bad son, he said, and he said it quietly, not dramatically, not as a performance. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying and are finally setting down. I looked at my youngest child, 44 years old, uncomfortable in a plastic porch chair 12 minutes from where I'd lived for 30 years. I thought about the boy he'd been, the one who'd been afraid of thunderstorms until he was embarrassingly old, and who'd never admitted it to his older siblings, who'd climbed into our bed on the bad nights and fallen back asleep between Carolyn and me like a small boat finding harbor. Yeah, I said. You have been. He nodded. He didn't argue. He took a sip of his beer, and we sat there a while longer, and neither of us said anything that fixed anything, because some things don't get fixed in an afternoon on a cold porch. But something moved. Something that had been locked for a long time shifted, just slightly, just enough that I could feel the change in the air between us. I didn't tell him about the money. I didn't tell him about the notebooks, or James Hollis, or the work I'd been doing to build something out of all those years of silence. But I thought about what I was building, and whether there was a version of it that left room for this. For a 44-year-old man sitting on a cold porch, finally telling his father the truth about himself. Maybe there was. Maybe I'd been wrong to close that door entirely. What I knew, sitting there while the light went gray and the beer went warm, was that the conversation had happened too late. Not too late to matter. Nothing human is ever quite too late to matter. But too late to change what was already in motion. Too late to undo the record, or the plan, or the decision I'd been slowly arriving at for 2 years. The estate document was almost finished. James had called that week and said we were getting close, that he'd want me to review the final draft within the month, and that when I was ready he thought we should schedule a formal meeting to present it. I told him I was close to ready. Thomas and I sat on the porch until it was too cold to sit anymore. Then he went home to his family 12 minutes away, and I went inside to my kitchen, and I made myself dinner, and I ate it standing at the counter because setting the table for one still felt wasteful, and I thought about Carolyn and about Harold and about $40 million sitting quietly in the world while my children talked about selling my house. I thought about what came next. James called on a Thursday morning in November, which was unremarkable in every external way. Gray sky, cold coming through the kitchen window frame where the caulking had dried out, Frank's bird feeder swinging empty because I'd forgotten to refill it. I was on my second cup of coffee when my phone rang and James said, without preamble, the way he always spoke when something was decided, "The document is ready. When do you want to meet?" I'd been waiting for this call for 2 years, and now that it was here, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, but a low, steady ache. The kind that comes not from doing the wrong thing, but from doing the right thing too late. You can be correct and still grieve what the correctness cost you. "Next week," I said. "And James, I want the children there." A pause. "All 3 of them?" "All 3. Another pause, longer. James had been my attorney for 9 years. He knew enough about my family to understand what I was asking, and he knew me well enough not to argue with it once my tone went to that particular register. "I'll need a reason to give them," he said. "They'll want to know what the meeting is about. Tell them it's about my estate and my health situation. Tell them it concerns all 3 of them and that I'd like everyone present." "That's going to get their attention." "That's the idea," I said. I hung up and sat with my coffee and looked out at Frank's empty bird feeder turning slow circles in the November wind. I thought about what I was setting in motion. I thought about Thomas on the porch with his warm beer, saying I've been a bad son in that quiet, unperformed way. I thought about Daniel's voice cracking open on the phone, all the practiced surface of him suddenly gone. I thought about Rachel, who I'd spoken to twice since her call about the house, both times short, both times ending with her rushing off somewhere urgent, a meeting, the kids, Marcus needing something, always somewhere else to be. I thought about Carolyn, who had seen all of this coming and had tried in those last weeks to warn me. "Don't let them take advantage, Ethan. You're too soft." I wasn't soft anymore. I wasn't sure when exactly that had changed, but it had, and the change felt less like hardening and more like clarity. Like the particular stillness of a man who has finally, after a very long time, decided what he's going to do. I got up and went to refill Frank's bird feeder. James sent the meeting invitation by email, which Rachel acknowledged within 2 hours, and Thomas acknowledged the next morning. Daniel took 4 days and then called me directly, which was itself different. He was calling me, not James, which meant he was unsettled in a way that wanted reassurance rather than information. "Dad, what's this about?" James's email was vague. "It's about the estate," I said. "I want everyone together." "Are you sick? Is something—" "I'm fine, Daniel. I'll see you Thursday." "Dad, Thursday," I said, and left it there. What happened in the days before the meeting I can only describe as a kind of pressure building. Not in me, but around me. Rachel called twice. Thomas stopped by on Tuesday, unannounced, which he almost never did, and stood in my kitchen with his coat still on, asking careful questions that were all really the same question. What is happening, and how does it affect me? I gave him coffee and told him the same thing I'd told Daniel. I'm fine. Thursday. Sandra called me directly on Wednesday evening. That was new. Sandra and I had spoken on the phone perhaps a dozen times in 11 years, and the calls were always brief and stilted. The kind of communication that happens between two people who have agreed, without ever saying so, to tolerate each other for the sake of someone else. Her voice was measured, which was how Sandra's voice always was when she was working at something. Ethan, I just wanted to check in. Thomas said there's a meeting with your attorney. That's right. I hope everything is okay, health-wise. I'm fine, Sandra. Of course. A small pause, a recalibration. I know Thomas would love to help if there's anything that needs managing. He's very capable, with financial things. I almost laughed. I did not laugh. Thank you, Sandra. I'll see Thomas Thursday. She said goodbye in a voice that had gone careful and flat. And I hung up and thought, she already knows something is different. Sandra was sharp. She'd always been the smartest one in the room and had always known it, which was both her greatest quality and the reason I'd never quite trusted her. Smart people who know they're smart have a way of treating everyone else's territory as navigable if they just apply the right approach. Sandra had been applying approaches to me for years. This was just another one. But Thursday was coming, and approaches weren't going to change what was already written. They all arrived within 15 minutes of each other, which meant they'd coordinated. Or rather, Rachel had coordinated, because Rachel always coordinated. She arrived first because Rachel was constitutionally incapable of being anything other than early to things that mattered to her, and this clearly mattered to her. She was wearing a blazer, which told me she'd treated this like a meeting she needed to be professionally dressed for, which told me something about how she'd framed it in her head. She hugged me at the door. It was a real hug, or at least a longer one than usual. Dad, you look good. Thank you. The house looks... She stopped. She'd been about to say something about the house and caught herself. Come in, I said. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later, flying in from Arizona on a morning flight he'd booked 5 days ago. The speed of the booking was its own information, because Daniel only moved fast when something was at stake for him personally. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who'd been anxious for days and not sleeping well, and he gripped my arm when he came through the door and said, Dad, seriously, you're okay? And I said yes, and I could see him trying to decide whether to believe me. Thomas came with Sandra, which I hadn't expected. The invitation had said family, and I suppose she qualified, and I wasn't going to make an issue of it. Sandra shook my hand when she came in, which was the kind of formality we'd long settled into, and then looked around the living room with the quick cataloging sweep of a person who can't help assessing real estate even at the worst possible time. James arrived at 1 o'clock exactly, because James was never late and never early. He was 62, trim, silver-haired, carrying a leather briefcase that he'd had for as long as I'd known him, and that had taken on the particular quality of something that has absorbed enough important moments to feel significant on its own. He shook my hand, then the others, introducing himself in the pleasant professional manner that revealed nothing. We sat in the living room. I'd moved the chairs around that morning, set out water glasses, thought briefly about whether to make coffee, and decided against it. This wasn't meant to feel like hospitality. Rachel sat on the couch with her hands folded in her lap. Daniel was in the armchair, leaning forward, elbows on knees. Thomas and Sandra shared the love seat, Sandra very straight, Thomas doing the thing he did when he was uncomfortable, pressing his thumbnail into his palm in a small, repetitive motion he'd had since childhood. James set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it. He took out a folder, set it in front of him, and looked around the room. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Your father asked me to be here today because he has some things he wants you to understand, and he felt that having me present would be useful." He glanced at me. I nodded. Before I explain the specifics, I want to note that Ethan is in good health, his cognitive functioning is excellent, and everything you're about to hear represents decisions he has made freely, fully informed, and over a period of considerable time. Are there any questions before I begin? Nobody spoke, but the room changed in that particular way rooms change when something real is about to happen. A kind of collective intake of breath, a stillness that has nothing to do with quiet. "Good," James said. He opened the folder. "I'll start with some context that may be unfamiliar to you." And then he began. He explained Harold Vance first. The estate, the assets, the way Harold had structured things over 50 years of careful, anonymous work. He laid it out methodically. The land holdings, the commercial properties, the investment portfolio. And I watched my children's faces as the numbers entered the room. Rachel's expression went through several changes in about 4 seconds. First confusion, then the particular focused stillness of someone recalculating, then something that looked almost like she'd been physically struck. Daniel sat back in the armchair. His mouth opened and closed once without sound. Thomas had gone completely still. Beside him, Sandra's hand was on his knee, and I watched her grip tighten, though her face stayed composed. James said, "The net value of the estate, as of this year's assessment, is approximately $42 million. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Rachel made a sound, not a word, just a small, involuntary exhale. Daniel said, "Jesus." Thomas kept looking at James with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager confronted with something he'd done that couldn't be undone. "Dad," Rachel said. She turned to me and her voice had changed entirely. The efficient, managed quality it usually had was gone, and underneath it was something raw and young and completely unguarded. "Dad, you... all this time..." "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you..." She stopped, started again. "We didn't know." "No," I said. "You didn't." Daniel leaned forward again, and I could see him working through it. The $40,000 he'd asked me for, the calls I hadn't returned fast enough, the years of distance. I could see him adding it up against the number James had just said, and the math was not comfortable. "Is this..." He looked at James. "Is this real?" "Completely," James said. Sandra spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind you maintain with effort. "When did you inherit this, Ethan?" "Several years ago," I said. "Harold's estate took time to settle." "Years," she repeated. She said the word with a particular flatness, and I understood that she was doing math of her own, calculating how long I'd sat in my small house with my taped linoleum and my cracked dashboard Subaru while they made plans about selling that house, while they discussed my estimated time of death over dinner, while she called me the old man problem in my son's kitchen, not knowing I was in the hallway. The thought of that hallway moment didn't give me the satisfaction I might have expected. It just made me tired. James said, "There's more, and this is the part your father specifically wanted you to hear in person." He walked them through the estate plan deliberately, the way you explain something to people who need to hear every word and not miss any of it. The charitable distributions first, the community garden expansion specifically named, which made Marguerite's face flash across my mind so vividly, I nearly smiled. Patricia Huang's literacy nonprofit, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students at the regional university, structured as an endowment. A trust for Frank Dalton's granddaughter, set up to cover the gap in her tuition and extend through graduate school if she chose to pursue it. Each one landed differently on my children's faces. Rachel was doing something I recognized from her childhood, making herself very still when she was processing something upsetting, controlling the expression so tightly that the control itself became visible. Daniel had stopped leaning forward. He was sitting back, hands loose between his knees, looking at the coffee table with the particular blankness of a man who's been caught not by anyone outside himself, but by the full weight of his own choices. Thomas was looking at me. Just looking, not speaking, with an expression I didn't quite know how to read. Then James got to the children's portions. He named the number for each of them. I won't give you the exact figures. That's between my family and whatever they make of it. But I'll tell you that the amounts were meaningful. Not symbolic gesture meaningful. Not, here's $100 meaningful. Real money. Enough to genuinely help each of them if they were sensible with it. Enough to make a difference. And enough to make clear, without anyone having to say it, exactly what the rest of the $42 million had gone to instead. Rachel said, That's our portion?" "Yes," James said, "out of $42 million. The distributions are structured as your father decided. He can speak to his reasoning if he chooses." All three of them looked at me. Sandra was looking at me too, and for once her expression wasn't managed. It was just naked, undisguised calculation transitioning into something that might have been the beginning of genuine shock. I took a breath. I hadn't planned a speech. I thought about this moment for months, had run versions of it through my mind on the porch, in the garden, in the evenings with the radio on, and what I'd learned from all that rehearsing was that the actual moment never matches the rehearsal, so you might as well just say the truth. I've been thinking about what I wanted to say to you, I said, for a long time. And what I keep coming back to is this. I love you, all three of you. That hasn't changed. It won't change. Nobody spoke. But love isn't a blank check, I said. I spent 11 years being your father in whatever way you needed me to be, which mostly meant being a place you called when you needed something, and a problem you discussed when you thought I wasn't listening. I looked at Thomas when I said that last part. His jaw tightened. I understand why that happened. I let it happen. I was too soft, as your mother would have said, and she was right. Rachel had tears on her face. She wasn't wiping them, just letting them sit there, which was so unlike her careful self-presentation that it undid me a little, though I held steady. The people I'm leaving the majority of this estate to, I said, showed up. That's the whole thing. That's the entire explanation. They showed up, not for what I had, because they didn't know I had anything. They showed up for me, for the person, the old man with the taped-up floor and the garden plot and the cracked dashboard car. I paused. I've kept track. I know that sounds cold, and maybe it is, but I needed to know the truth of what these years had been, not the story I wanted to believe about them. Daniel said quietly, "The notebooks." I looked at him. "You always had notebooks in the kitchen," he said. "I remember. When I was a kid, you wrote everything in those notebooks." "Yes," I said. "I did." He nodded slowly, like something was settling into place that had been suspended for a long time. James said carefully, "There are conditions attached to the children's portions as well, if anyone would like to hear them." Sandra stood up. I hadn't expected that. A physical movement, abrupt, the love seat shifting as she rose. Thomas looked up at her. "Sandra, give me a minute," she said. To me, not to Thomas. To me. And her voice had stripped itself of everything managed, everything applied. She was just talking. "You heard us in Rachel's hallway the night we came for dinner." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. Something moved through her face. Not quite shame. I don't think Sandra had a very practiced relationship with shame, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of being seen, fully, in a moment you'd assumed was private. She sat back down. Thomas put his hand over hers. She let him. "I owe you an apology," she said, and the words clearly cost her something, which made them worth more than if they'd come easy. "You do," I said, "and I appreciate you saying so." Rachel said, "Dad, the conditions." "What are the conditions?" James opened to the next page of the folder. "Each portion is held in trust for 12 months from today. During that period, Ethan has requested—" He glanced at me, and I nodded. "He's requested monthly contact. Not money, not requests for anything, just contact. A phone call, a visit, a letter. Sustained, genuine over time. At the end of the 12 months, the trust distributions are released in full." Daniel said, "That's it?" "That's it," James said. Rachel made a sound that was almost a laugh, though it wasn't funny exactly. It was the sound of someone absorbing an irony so complete it transcends humor. All these years, I thought. All these years, and what I was asking for was a phone call. Thomas was looking at me again with that unreadable expression, and then I realized it wasn't unreadable. I just hadn't seen it in so long I'd forgotten what it looked like. It was grief. Not for the money, not for what the estate plan cost him, just grief. Simple, clean, too late. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry." And unlike the porch, unlike the beer, and the carefully chosen words, this time it hit somewhere different, because his voice broke on it, just slightly, just enough, and I don't think he meant it to. I don't think he was performing. I didn't say it's okay. I didn't say I know you are. I let it sit, because some apologies need room to exist without being immediately absorbed and processed and filed away. This one deserved a little space. After a while, I said, "Then start now." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Daniel laughed, a short, rough laugh with nothing comfortable in it, and pressed both hands over his face and sat there like that for a few seconds. And I watched my middle child do the hardest thing, sit with the full weight of what he'd been, without anywhere to put it except himself. Rachel reached over and put her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. James began quietly collecting his papers. The folder closed. The briefcase latched. Outside, through the window, Frank's bird feeder was spinning slow circles in the November wind, still empty because I'd forgotten again to fill it this morning, and I thought, I'll do that tomorrow. The room was full of people I loved and had been failed by and had, in my quieter moments, failed in return. It was full of something unresolved and painful and completely, irreversibly real. No version of the next hours or days or months was going to be smooth. There would be more tears, probably, and more anger, and the 12 months ahead of us would have moments that felt like progress, and moments that slid backward, and probably one or two I hadn't thought to anticipate. But the notebooks were done. The plan was in the world. The truth was in the room. And somewhere out there, Marguerite's garden was about to get the funding it needed to grow. They left that afternoon in 3 different directions, which felt appropriate. Rachel walked to her car with the deliberate posture of someone holding themselves together by sheer structural will. Daniel hugged me at the door. A real hug, longer than the one at arrival, the kind where you can feel a person deciding whether to let go. And then stood on the porch for a moment looking at the yard before he went to his rental car without saying anything else. Thomas and Sandra left together, and Sandra didn't shake my hand this time. She just nodded, once, and that nod carried more honesty than most of the interactions we'd had in 15 years. James was the last to go. He packed his briefcase, put on his coat, and paused at the door. "That went about as well as it could have," he said. "You think so?" He considered it. "There was no yelling. Nobody walked out. That's the best I could have projected." "Low bar," I said. "Family law, Ethan. Low bars are what we build on." He left. I stood in my living room, which suddenly felt both very large and very quiet, and I looked at the chairs I'd arranged that morning, still positioned in their deliberate semicircle, and thought about all the conversations that had happened in that room. Carolyn in the armchair when she was sick, and we pretended things were fine, the kids opening gifts at Christmas when they were young enough that gifts were still magic, Thomas on rainy Sundays watching football with the volume too loud. All of it had happened in this room, and now this had happened too, and there was no way to fold it back in with the other memories and pretend the shape was the same. I made myself dinner. I ate it at the table, not the counter. I didn't entirely know why. The 12 months that followed were the strangest of my life. Not the hardest. The 4 months of Carolyn's illness were harder, and the year after her death, which had a quality of gray endlessness that I couldn't see through at the time. But the 12 months after the meeting in my living room were strange in a very specific way. For the first time in years, things were actually happening. Movement after stillness. People showing up who hadn't shown up before. And me, trying to navigate the difference between what was real and what was just the estate plan talking. That was the hardest part. That was the question I couldn't stop turning over. Is this real, or is this just what $42 million looks like in human behavior? Rachel called 4 days after the meeting. I was in the garden with Marguerite, who had nearly fallen off a stepping stool 2 days earlier when I'd told her about the funding and had grabbed my arm and said, "Ethan Mercer, if you're joking with me right now, I will never forgive you." And I'd said I wasn't joking, and she'd sat down very suddenly on an overturned bucket and pressed both hands to her face and stayed that way for almost a minute, while I stood there feeling, for the first time in longer than I could track, like I'd done something genuinely good. Rachel's call came while I had dirt on both hands, which meant I answered it slightly out of breath from fumbling with the phone. "Dad, is this an okay time?" "I'm in the garden. Just give me a second." I peeled off one glove, pressed the phone to my ear. "Okay, I'm here." She paused. The kind of pause that means someone has rehearsed what they're about to say and is now deciding whether the rehearsed version is what they actually want to deliver. I've been thinking, she said, about what you said, about showing up. And I want you to know that I understand. I understand the words. I'm still working on really understanding them, if that makes sense. It makes sense, I said. I told Marcus what happened, all of it, and he said, she stopped again. He said he'd been worried for years that I treated you like a task. His words, that I managed you instead of loving you. A small, uneven breath. He's not wrong. I crouched by the tomato stakes that needed resetting and thought about Marcus, whom I'd always liked more than Rachel had credited. A quiet, decent man who drove past my exit on the highway and had apparently been watching his wife handle her father with the detached efficiency of a project manager and had been uncomfortable with it for years. That took honesty, I said, from both of you. It wasn't comfortable honesty, she said, in case you were wondering. I almost smiled. That was Rachel. Even in an apology, the precision of her language, the need to qualify. Are you calling because of the condition or because you want to? I asked. Not cruelly, just directly, which was new between us. Silence. Then, both. Is that an honest enough answer? Yes, I said. That's fine. Both is fine. Call me next week too. She said she would, and she did. Daniel's version of the 12 months was the most turbulent, which surprised nobody who knew him. He flew back to Arizona after the meeting, and for 3 weeks I heard nothing. Not a call, not a text, which started to feel like its own answer about who he was and whether he'd changed. Then he called on a Sunday at 7 in the morning, which was 4 in the morning his time, and I knew before I answered that something had happened. I left Gina, he said. Gina was his girlfriend of 2 years, whom I'd met exactly once at a dinner that had been strained from the appetizers forward. What happened? It's a long story. He sounded exhausted in the particular way of someone who's been awake making a decision. The short version is she found out about the estate, and the way she found out about it changed some things. I waited. She went through my phone, he said, found the thread with you, read the whole thing, and then she wanted to talk about what our future could look like now that... He stopped. She used the word trajectory. She talked about our trajectory, and I just thought I don't know. I just couldn't. I'm sorry, Daniel. Don't be. I'm not, really. He paused. Dad, can I come out in a few weeks? Not to ask for anything. I want to sit on your porch for a while. Frank's coffee is better than mine, I said. But yes, come. He came in December, and the three of us, Frank, Daniel, and I, sat on the porch in the cold with coats and mugs and Frank's particular brand of blunt, friendly conversation that doesn't allow for pretense. Frank asked Daniel about Arizona, about what he did, about what he was going to do next, with the direct curiosity of a man who's lived enough life to find other people's genuinely interesting. Daniel answered more openly than I'd heard him talk in years. At some point, Frank told the story of his son not calling for 2 weeks and the fixed step on the back porch, and Daniel listened to it without speaking. And when Frank finished, Daniel said, "Did it stick?" "The fixing." Frank thought about it. "Most of it," he said. "Some of it needs refixing every couple years. That's just how it is with things that were broken once." Daniel nodded like that was the most useful thing anyone had said to him in months, which maybe it was. He stayed 4 days. He helped me replace the caulking around the kitchen window. He didn't do it particularly well. It was uneven in places and he pressed too hard at the corners. But he did it, and the draft that had been coming through that window since October was gone, and I thought about Frank's fixed step and didn't say anything about the uneven caulking except thank you. Thomas was the most consistent, which was the thing that surprised me most and cost me the most to reckon with, because consistency from Thomas meant confronting how different it felt from what the previous 11 years had been. He called every week. Not always long calls. Sometimes just 10 minutes, checking in, telling me about Leo's college applications, about Brianna's volleyball tournament, small things, daily things. The kind of things you tell someone when you're keeping them in your life rather than checking in on them from a distance. Some calls were easy. Some were awkward in the particular way of a relationship rebuilding its vocabulary after a long time without use. In January, he brought Leo to meet me for lunch. Not because I'd asked, because Thomas had decided his 17-year-old son ought to know his grandfather before his grandfather was gone, which was a sentence that hurt more than I showed, but that I was also grateful to hear. Leo was quiet, studious, awkward, in the manner of a teenager who's been told this lunch matters and is trying not to show that the pressure is affecting him. We ate sandwiches at a diner, and I asked him about the colleges he was considering, and he came alive a little talking about it. Environmental engineering, he was thinking, which made me think of Frank's granddaughter and her scholarship, and the particular thread that runs through a generation of young people who've decided to take the broken world seriously. You should talk to someone who's actually in that field, I said. I know a young woman who's studying environmental science. She's good. She might be willing to talk to you about it. Leo looked up. Yeah? If you're interested. He was interested. I called Frank that evening, and Frank called his granddaughter Ellie, and 3 weeks later, Leo and Ellie had a video call that lasted 90 minutes, which Leo told Thomas about in a text that night, and Thomas texted me. He talked about it for an hour after. Thank you, Dad. That text sat in my phone, and I looked at it several times over the following week. Not because it was dramatic or revelatory, so it was 2 sentences, but because of the thank you, Dad, at the end of it, which landed differently than it would have 6 months earlier. Before, gratitude from Thomas had the texture of obligation. The thank you say, because manners require it. This one felt like it cost something, like he'd meant it and knew that meaning it was no longer something he could do cheaply. Sandra was harder. I want to be honest about that. The apology she'd offered in the living room was real. I believed it. But real apologies between people who've never quite understood each other don't automatically translate into ease. Sandra and I spent the 12 months in a careful, slightly formal détente that was better than what came before, but wasn't warm. And I don't think either of us pretended it was. She came with Thomas on 2 visits and was present without being hostile, which I decided to count as meaningful progress. She asked me once, over coffee in my kitchen, how I'd known what I wanted to do with the estate. Not accusatory, just genuinely curious. I had a lot of time to think, I said. You kept it secret for years, she said. That must have been... She looked for a word. Strange. Living with it. Sometimes, I said. But I wasn't ready. I needed to see clearly first. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked out the kitchen window, and I thought, somewhere in there is a woman who has done things she's not proud of, which makes her the same as everyone else. Being cruel to a lonely old man doesn't make you a monster. It makes you a person who made choices she'll have to carry. Sandra would carry those choices. I could already see her carrying them in the set of her shoulders and the way she sometimes went quiet when the kids talked about visiting me now, as if she were absorbing the specific shape of what she'd cost them. That was enough for me. Not forgiveness exactly. I wasn't ready to use that word, and I wasn't going to use it just because it was the tidy, expected thing. But enough. A door that had been shut was open a few inches. I could feel the air coming through. In March, Patricia Huang called me from the literacy nonprofit to say the first tranche of funding had cleared and she'd be able to keep all 3 of her staff members and open the new reading program she'd had planned for 2 years. She thanked me 3 times in the first 2 minutes of the call. I told her to stop thanking me and tell me about the program instead, which she did for 20 minutes, with the specific joy of a person who has been fighting for something for so long that its arrival doesn't quite feel real yet. I sat at my kitchen table after that call and thought about Harold Vance in his care facility common room sliding an envelope across the table to me. You stayed. 2 words. The whole explanation. I thought about all the ways staying is underrated. How staying gets called passivity, gets called weakness, gets called having nothing better to do. How the world tends to celebrate the people who go, who build empires, who move fast, who make dramatic gestures in the right direction. How it rarely stops to notice the people who just keep showing up. Keep making the coffee, keep pulling the weeds, keep answering the phone. Harold had stayed. Frank stayed. Marguerite had stayed beside me in the mud of an April garden and asked me the question nobody else in my life was asking. I had eventually stayed for myself. had decided that my own life was worth staying for, worth protecting, worth building something out of. That was the part nobody could do for me. That was the part that took 11 years too long. The thing nobody tells you about the 12 months is that they're not linear. People don't just steadily improve. Relationships don't just gradually warm on a consistent upward slope. There were setbacks that set my teeth on edge and made me wonder if I'd misjudged everything. In April, 6 months in, I found out through Frank, who'd heard it from a neighbor who knew Marcus, that Rachel had told people at her office about the estate. Not the plan, not what had happened, but the number. The $42 million. She'd told people at her office, which meant it had spread in the way things spread. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from a man I barely remembered, the husband of a woman Carolyn and I had known 20 years ago, asking very carefully worded questions about Harold's estate and whether there were other heirs being sought. I called Rachel. "Did you tell people?" I asked. A pause that was its own answer. "Rachel. I told one person," she said. "My friend Claire. I didn't think she'd—" "You told your friend Claire the details of my personal estate while we're in the middle of a 12-month period in which I'm watching whether you can be trusted with my personal affairs." Silence. "Do you understand how that lands?" I said. "Yes." Her voice had gone small. "Dad, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking." "I know you weren't," I said. "That's the problem." We didn't speak for 2 weeks after that. It was the longest gap in the 12 months, and it cost us both something. And when she called again, she didn't open with an explanation or a defense. She just said, "I want to do better than that. I know I have to show you that, not just say it." I let the 2 weeks be what they were. A consequence, not a punishment, just the natural result of a choice. And then I said, "Okay," and we moved forward. That was the test inside the test. Not just whether they'd call, but what they'd do when they got it wrong again. Because getting it wrong again was inevitable. These were not transformed people in the span of 12 months. They were the same people, making the same kinds of mistakes, but now at least aware that the mistakes had weight. Now at least trying. Daniel signed on with a small consulting firm in May and called me to tell me about it. Called me first, before his siblings, which I noted with the particular quiet attention I'd developed for noticing what was different. He'd been in real estate consulting before, but this felt more structured, he said, more accountable. He had someone looking over his shoulder now, in a way that used to chafe, and that he'd decided at 48 to stop fighting. "I need the oversight," he said. "I know that about myself. I've just been too proud to admit it." "That's not a small thing to admit," I said. "No," he said. "It isn't." A pause. "Dad, the call I made to you that night I asked for 40,000. Daniel, let me say this. That was the worst version of myself, using you like that, and I knew it even while I was doing it. That's the part I can't quite get past. That I knew." I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the spring was doing what Ohio spring does, green coming back so fast it looks almost aggressive after the gray of winter. "The knowing," I said, "is how it gets better. You can't fix what you don't see clearly." He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then, "Mom would have said that." "She did say that," I said. "To me, more than once." We talked for another hour. It was the longest call we'd had since he was in his 20s, and used to call me on Sunday nights when he was broke and lonely and hadn't yet learned to be ashamed of needing people. Somewhere in the conversation I started to hear that younger Daniel, not the smoothed-over version, not the operator version, just the kid who needed his father, which was something I hadn't been allowed to be in years. I held that conversation in my mind for a long time after. Summer came, and with it something I hadn't anticipated. I started to feel something in the house that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but the particular warmth of a place that people move through. Thomas brought Brianna over one Saturday, and she helped me in the garden. Not because she wanted to, but because Thomas had asked her to, and she was doing it out of obligation, which was honest and therefore fine. She turned out, once she stopped performing reluctant teenager, to have a real feel for it. She found the method quickly, asked good questions, and by the end of the afternoon was genuinely interested in whether the zucchini would make it. You should come back in August, I said. See how it turns out. She came back in August. She brought a friend. They both ate the zucchini, or at least politely tried it, which was more than most people had ever done with my zucchini. Frank watched all of this with the satisfaction of a man who has fixed enough broken things to recognize what fixing looks like in the early stages. He didn't say much about it, which was how Frank showed approval. He stopped commenting, which was louder than anything he could have said. In September, 11 months in, Marguerite held the first planning meeting for the garden expansion at the community center. She asked me to come, which I did, and she introduced me to the room. 30 or 40 people, some of whom I recognized and many I didn't. Not as the donor, not as the money, but as my friend Ethan, who believed this mattered. That was the sentence she used. Who believed this mattered. And something in me that had been holding tension for a very long time finally, slowly, let go. I looked around that room at people who were there because they believed something mattered, and I thought about Harold's envelope sliding across the table, and the notebook on the shelf, and all the years of quiet watching, and Carolyn saying, "You're too soft," and Frank saying, "It starts working," and Daniel on the porch in December saying, "I just want to sit here for a while," all of it, every piece, leading to this room, these people, this moment that looked from the outside like nothing dramatic, just a community meeting, just some people planning a garden. The most important things often look from the outside like nothing much. 12 months were almost up, and I was still there. Still in my small house, still drinking coffee on Frank's porch, still taping the linoleum corner when it came up, because fixing it properly would mean admitting that I'd let it go too long. And some things you let go too long, you just keep patching instead. But the window was sealed. The draft was gone. And somewhere in Arizona, a man I raised was trying to become someone worth knowing. That was enough to sit with for now. The 12 months ended on a Thursday. Not dramatically, no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement. James called in the morning to confirm that the trust distributions would process by end of week, and I said thank you, and he said you're welcome, and that was that. The calendar page turned the way calendar pages do, without asking your permission or caring particularly what it means to you. I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and thought about the fact that a year ago I had sat in this same chair and watched my children try to absorb the news that the father they'd been managing for 11 years had been, the whole time, someone they didn't know at all. I thought about Rachel's face when the number landed, Daniel pressing his hands over his eyes. Thomas, still and quiet, finally arriving at grief. A year is not enough time to undo 11. I knew that. I'd known it going in. What a year can do is begin something, can crack a window that had been painted shut, let a little air through, enough to breathe differently. Whether what comes through the window is worth the effort of opening it depends on what's on the other side. I was still deciding what was on the other side. That was the honest answer. But I was deciding it with more information than I'd had before. And that, at 73, is something. Rachel drove out the weekend after the distributions cleared. She called first, which she always did now, a small shift that I'd stopped consciously noticing and started simply expecting, which is how you know a behavior has become real rather than performed. She asked if she could bring Marcus, which surprised me, and I said yes. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon with a bag of groceries, not a symbolic gesture bag, not wine and flowers, but an actual bag of things. Pasta, a jar of sauce, salad stuff, a loaf of bread from the good bakery in their town that I'd mentioned once, months ago, in a conversation I hadn't thought she'd retained. She'd retained it. We cooked dinner together in my small kitchen, which required a certain amount of physical negotiation because the kitchen is not built for 3 adults who are all slightly uncomfortable with each other. Marcus kept bumping into things and apologizing. Rachel kept correcting the pasta water, the wrong pot, not enough salt, in the manner of a woman who cannot observe an inefficiency without addressing it, which was maddening, and also, I realized, very familiar. She'd gotten that from Carolyn. Carolyn had been the same way in a kitchen. I'd forgotten. "You're doing the thing your mother did," I said. Rachel looked up. "What thing?" "The pasta thing, the pot, the salt. She did that the same motion." I gestured inadequately. "The way you hold the salt box." She looked at the salt box in her hand. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to manage. I didn't know I did that. You didn't used to, I said. It's new, the last couple years. She put the salt box down and didn't say anything for a moment, and Marcus very diplomatically found something to do in the refrigerator, and we both just stood there with the pasta water starting to move at the bottom of the pot, and the particular weight of Carolyn in the room between us, which was not comfortable and not uncomfortable, but just present, the way the dead are sometimes present in a kitchen when someone does the thing they always did and doesn't know they're doing it. I miss her, Rachel said, simply. Just that. I know, I said. So do I. We ate dinner at the table. The four of us. Frank had walked over when he saw the car, because Frank treated my house as semi-communal in a way that I'd long since stopped objecting to. Talked for 3 hours. Not about the estate, not about the year, not about any of the weight. Just about things. Marcus's work, Frank's granddaughter Ellie, and how she was finishing her second year. A movie Rachel and Marcus had seen that Frank had a surprisingly strong opinion about for someone who'd seen it described only in summary. The kind of conversation that only happens when people are relaxed enough to follow the current of it without trying to steer. I watched Rachel laugh at something Frank said, a real laugh, head back, unguarded. And I thought, this is what it was supposed to be. Not always, not easily, not without the year of work it took to get here. But this. A kitchen, people eating together, someone doing the thing with the salt box that reminds you of someone you loved. This was what I'd been protecting the whole time, not the $40 million. This. Face it, Daniel didn't come for the end of the 12 months. He called, which was what he could manage from Arizona, and the call was good. Long, genuine, the kind of conversation that wanders and doubles back and ends up somewhere neither person planned. He'd been promoted at the consulting firm to something that sounded more senior, and he explained what it meant with the specific pleasure of a person who has worked for something real rather than gambling on something fast. It's not glamorous, he said. It's just steady. I'm doing steady work and getting steady results, and I don't have to explain myself at the end of every quarter. I forgot what that felt like. Your grandfather, I said, meaning Harold. Daniel had known Harold only as a distant, quiet presence at family events, Carolyn's strange father with the old pickup. Built everything he had by being steady, 50 years of steady. I'm starting to understand that, Daniel said. You're 48, I said. You have time. Do I? Not defensive, genuinely asking. You have enough, I said. That's all anyone gets. There was a pause, and then he said something I hadn't expected. Dad, when I came out in December, sat on your porch, that was the first time in years I felt like, I don't know, like I was somewhere I was allowed to just be. Not selling anything, not fixing anything, not managing how I came across, just there. I held the phone for a moment without speaking. That's what I tried to give you, I finally said. When you were small, that's what home is supposed to be. I know, he said. I know. I took it for granted. Yes, I said. You did. I'm sorry, Dad. He said it without qualifier, without the softening I know this doesn't make up for, or the deflecting I was going through a lot. Just the words. Clean. I know you are, I said. Start from there. With Thomas, the end of the 12 months came with something I hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted, which is how the most important things tend to arrive. He came over on a Sunday in early November, the anniversary, almost exactly, of the meeting. And he brought Leo, and Leo had something with him. A folder, college application style, held in both hands with the slightly self-conscious formality of a teenager presenting something he's worked on. Leo has something to show you, Thomas said. I looked at my grandson, 17, lanky, still doing the thing teenagers do where they're not quite comfortable in their own body yet. He held out the folder. Inside was an application, an environmental engineering program, one of the schools he'd been considering, one of the good ones, and behind it, a personal essay. Can I read this? I asked. That's why I brought it, Leo said. The essay was about the video call with Ellie, about what she'd told him, about the work, the patience it required, the long timeline of environmental projects. The fact that you often don't see the results of what you're doing within your own career span, and you have to make peace with that. And then it was about me. About a Saturday at a diner and a grandfather he'd been embarrassed. He wrote this without embarrassment, to admit he didn't really know. About zucchini in August. About how he'd been thinking about what it meant to invest in something you wouldn't live to see the full result of. And how that was actually, and these were his words, this 17-year-old kid's words, the most serious kind of love there is. I read it twice. I held it for a moment after the second reading. "Leo," I said, "this is good." He exhaled. "Yeah? It's honest. That's the most important thing in a piece of writing. You can teach a lot of skills. You can't teach honest." He nodded, absorbing this with the particular attention of someone who is actually listening rather than waiting for his turn. Thomas was watching me from across the room, and when I looked up at him, his expression was the same one he'd had on the porch a year ago. Open, undefended, carrying something he'd decided to stop pretending wasn't heavy. But different now. A year different. A year of weekly calls and lunch at the diner and Brianna and the zucchini and all the small accumulated weight of actually showing up. He said quietly, so Leo couldn't hear, "Thank you for being there for him. He needed someone to open a door." "You could have opened it," I said, just as quietly. "Any time in the last 3 years." He didn't flinch. He'd stopped flinching at the truth this year, which was maybe the most significant change I'd seen in him. "I know," he said. "I should have." "But I did," I said, "and now the door's open. That's what matters going forward." He nodded. We weren't going to hug dramatically or say the thing that wraps the whole story up in a bow. That wasn't us, and I didn't want it to be. I've always been suspicious of resolution that arrives too neat, too complete, no rough edges left. The rough edges are how you know it was real. What we did instead was go into the kitchen, and I made coffee, and Leo sat at the table and we talked about his application until the afternoon went gray outside, and then Thomas and Leo drove home, and I stood in the doorway watching the taillights, and Frank's light was on next door, and his television was going, probably baseball even though it was November. And there was no baseball, just something he kept on for company. That was the shape of it. That was what remained. Sandra called me in December, alone. Not with Thomas, not as an extension of a Thomas conversation. Her own call, her own voice, and she opened it without preamble, which was very Sandra. "I want to say something and I need you to let me finish before you respond." "All right," I said. "I was unkind to you for years. Not dramatically. I never screamed at you or said anything to your face. But the quiet kind of unkind is sometimes worse because it's sustainable. You can keep it up forever, keep it deniable, keep pretending it doesn't cost anyone anything." A pause. "It cost you something. And it cost Thomas something he doesn't even fully understand yet, because he watched me be that way toward his father, and he learned from it without knowing he was learning. That's the part that bothers me." I held the phone and let her finish as I'd said I would. "I'm not asking you to be close to me," she said. "I know we're probably not going to be close. I wanted to say it plainly, without context, but I was going through, I was wrong about you. I treated you like a problem. You weren't a problem. You were a person." I let a few seconds sit there. "Sandra," I said, "I think you know by now that I don't give things away cheap. So when I tell you that took more honesty than most people manage in a lifetime, I mean it." She was quiet. "We're not going to be close," I agreed, "but we can be better than what we were. That's worth something." "Yes," she said, "it is." We talked for another 20 minutes, nothing heavy, just the filling in of spaces that happens when two people decide to make a little room for each other. It wasn't warm. It was civil and it was real, and that was more than I'd ever expected from Sandra, and I respected her for delivering it. "I want to tell you something now. Not about them, about me. Because I've been telling this story mostly as a record of what was done to me and what I chose to do about it, and that's the true shape of it. But it's not the complete shape. The complete shape has my own failures in it, and I owe you those. I was not a perfect father. Nobody is,
and the phrase perfect father is the kind of thing that only exists in eulogies and greeting cards. But I mean something specific. I missed things. When Rachel was in her 20s and working herself to exhaustion trying to prove something to a world that hadn't asked her to prove it, I saw the ambition and missed the fear underneath. I never asked her about the fear. I praised the results and didn't look at the cost. When Daniel was cycling through his ventures and his enthusiasms and his fresh starts, I helped him financially in ways that let him avoid the consequences he needed to feel. I thought I was being a good father. I was being a comfortable one, which is different. I protected him from reality in the name of love, and then felt betrayed when reality arrived anyway, and he didn't know how to handle it. That's on me as much as him. And Thomas who lived 12 minutes away and didn't come. I told myself the distance was his fault, his neglect, his choice. But I also never drove those 12 minutes myself. Not once, not uninvited, not to say I'm your father and I want to know you. I waited to be wanted instead of insisting on being present. That passivity was mine. I named it in everyone else and didn't look at it in the mirror. I'm telling you this because the lesson I took from these years isn't simply that my children failed me. The lesson is larger and harder than that, and it's this. Families don't fail in one direction. They fail in circles, each person's choices making room for the next person's mistakes, until you have a whole structure built on what nobody was willing to say out loud. What breaks the circle isn't punishment. It isn't the estate plan, though that was what cracked the surface. What breaks the circle is someone deciding to tell the truth about what they need, about what they've seen, about what they've done and what it cost, not just to themselves, but to the people around them. I was 71 years old before I decided to tell the truth about my own life. That's too long. I want to be clear about that. 2 years of planning and notebooks and quiet watching. It took longer than it should have because I was protecting something that didn't need protecting. My own discomfort with conflict, my own fear that if I said this is not okay, I will not be treated this way, I would lose what little I had left of them. But here is what I know now, on the other side of all of it. You cannot lose what isn't there. The relationships I was protecting in those years of silence were not real relationships. They were transactions with the word family written on them. Real relationships can withstand truth. They can withstand anger and grief and the long, uncomfortable work of becoming better. What they cannot withstand, what nothing can withstand, is the permanent replacement of honesty with performance. My children needed to know that I saw them clearly, not to punish them, not to take something from them, but because being seen clearly by the people who love you is the only thing that makes self-knowledge possible. I had spent 11 years pretending I didn't see what I saw, and in doing that I had taken something from them, the chance to be held accountable by someone who loved them enough to hold them. That was the failure I had to own. That was the thing I added to the record that wasn't in the notebooks. Marguerite's garden expansion opened in the spring of the following year. 2 new sites, 4 new full-time staff, a partnership with 3 schools in the district that brought kids in twice a week to learn where food comes from and why soil matters and what it means to tend something over a long period of time with no guarantee of what you'll get. She asked me to say something at the opening. I said no 3 times and then said yes, because Marguerite has a way of asking that doesn't leave much room for permanent refusal. I stood in front of maybe 60 people on a bright April morning, the kind of Ohio spring day that makes you forget winter was ever real, and I said something like this, not exactly this, because I was not at my most organized standing in front of 60 people, but this is the shape of it. The person who made this possible wasn't me. It was an old man I barely knew who spent 50 years making careful choices in the dark, where nobody could see them, because he didn't do things for the recognition. He did them because he thought they were right. And in the end, the only thing he wanted to give me was this, the chance to keep going. I'm 74 years old. I have a small house with a taped-up floor and a cracked dashboard car, and a neighbor who drinks my coffee and argues about baseball, and once sat in a clinic waiting room for 2 hours without being asked. I have 3 children who are, slowly and imperfectly, and on their own terms, learning to show up. I have a garden. I have $42 million doing work in the world that I will mostly not live to see finished. That last part used to seem like a loss. It doesn't anymore. The people clapped.
Marguerite was crying, which she would deny if you asked her. Frank was in the back with his granddaughter Ellie, who was back for the weekend, and he gave me the nod he gives when something meets his standard, which is both economical and, I've come to understand, about the highest form of praise he offers. Here is what I want to say directly to you, if you've come this far with me. I know there are people listening to this who are in the middle of what I was in the middle of, who are sitting in a house that feels too quiet, keeping track of the calls that don't come, and the visits that don't happen, and the slow realization that the people you made your life around have, somewhere along the way, stopped making their lives around you. Who are telling themselves, this is just how it is, this is what you have to accept. I want to tell you, you don't have to accept all of it. You're allowed to protect yourself. You're allowed to love your children and still say, I will not be treated this way. You're allowed to decide that your life, the one you are still living right now, is worth defending. Not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, out of the simple, fundamental understanding that a human being has dignity, and dignity is not something you earn by suffering quietly. It is something you claim by deciding that you are worth more than silence. And if the people around you don't see that, they've decided that your age means your life has moved into a waiting phase, that your house is already a future transaction, that your needs are a logistics problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved, then the most important thing you can do is refuse to agree with that assessment. Refuse it quietly. Refuse it with patience. Keep the notebooks if you need to. Build the life that makes sense to you with the people who actually show up, even if they don't look like the people you expected. And if the moment comes to tell the truth about what these years have been, tell it. Even if your voice shakes. Even if you're not sure it will matter. It matters. Even when it doesn't change everything, it matters. Because the alternative is going to your grave having let other people decide what your life meant, and that is the only waste I cannot make peace with. Harold Vance drove an old pickup and ate at diners and let 50 years of quiet work become something that outlasted him by generations. He told me with 2 words across a care facility table what he thought was worth giving. You stayed. I'm still here. Still in the small house, still in the garden, still drinking bad coffee with Frank on the porch when the weather allows, and arguing about a bird feeder that the squirrels will never stop destroying and that we will never stop refilling because some fights you keep up, not because you expect to win, but because the keeping up is the point. Thomas called last Sunday. 20 minutes. He told me about Leo's acceptance letter, the engineering program, the good one, the one the essay got him into, and I could hear in his voice the specific mix of pride and relief that parents feel when something they were afraid wasn't going to work out does. After he told me, there was a pause, and then he said, I want you to be there when he starts, in the fall. Come out, stay a few days. Will you do that? I said yes. It wasn't a grand moment, no music, no swelling emotion, no feeling of everything being resolved and healed and made whole. Just a father and a son, on the phone, making a plan to be in the same place at the same time. The smallest unit of what family is. But I'll tell you what I've learned at 74, after everything. The smallest unit is where it lives. Not in the grand gestures, not in the revelations in the living room, not even in the $42 million doing good work in the world. It lives in the plan to show up. The decision to be there. That's what love is when you strip everything else away. It's just that. The decision to be there. I made that decision for my children for 30 years, and then I stopped. And then, slowly, badly, imperfectly, they started making it for me. It's not the ending I would have written in the beginning, but it's the one I have, and it's mine. And some mornings, standing in the kitchen with the coffee going and the light coming through the window at the angle Carolyn always called the golden hour, I think it might be enough. It might be more than enough. It might be, in the end, exactly what I needed it to be.